And you may be seated. This morning you might notice that I have two chairs here. We're doing sermon a little bit different this morning. You're going to have three preachers, not one. So it's actually going to be, I think, a nice treat and a nice little change since we have a smaller, more nice little group here this morning. But there is a scripture that I want to read to you this morning. It comes from the lectionary reading. By now you've noticed in my 3+ months here as your interim that I follow a pattern of one Sunday I'll preach, usually one Sunday I'll preach from the lectionary, using the lectionary. For those who may not know what the lectionary is, it's basically a set of readings that covers essentially a 3-year period. During a 3-year period, year A, year B, year C. And you can literally, if you follow all of the readings, Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel reading, Psalm, you will cover the whole Bible essentially, the whole broad panorama of the Bible. It's really a great way of reading scriptures with other Christians throughout the world. It's also a great discipline for pastors who are preachers every Sunday, Sunday after Sunday, who need to be disciplined on great preaching. And the lectionary helps us to do that as pastors, keeps us disciplined on the theme, the important themes of the life of the church. Now, I have a variation, which is one Sunday on the lectionary. The next Sunday, it's going to be on something that I think really is key to the life of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. A theme, a moment, an observation that comes from the scriptures. And then again, the following Sunday, the lectionary. So this morning, it comes from the lectionary, and the reading is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And please keep in mind that Mark is not the only one that has this story. The story is also covered by Matthew. Now, unlike others, I prefer Mark's version. It's older. At least it may have been considered the first among the 4 Gospels. Although there are other versions of it in other non- or extra-biblical Gospels. So hear the word of the Lord. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre, northern part of Palestine, right there on the coast, if you will. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Apparently Jesus was doing some R&R. It was a long Memorial Day weekend. Yet he could not escape notice. I wonder why. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed at his feet. Capture that image for a moment. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syro-Phoenician origin. She was Greek, in other words. Was not a Jew. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, listen to these words, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, for saying that, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. God add rich blessings to the hearing and the doing of God's word. I must confess to you that there is perhaps no Bible lesson more disconcerting to a reader of the Gospels than this one. And it's really difficult for preachers to preach on this lesson. And if you are a new preacher, you have to be very careful that you do a good job in your exegetical work in order to be able to say something that makes sense. The story is riddled with what I would call, it's a fancy word, exegetical dilemma or landmines. Exegetical meaning, how do you take that story? Where does it come from? What are its roots? Why is it what it is? And then the hermeneutical, a fancy word for its application for us today. It's riddled with exegetical landmines. And by that I mean that the lesson for this morning, in it, we try to decipher as preachers, hopefully, the social and literary and religious and cultural assumptions in it, components of the text. What I like to call the stories behind the story, in order to come up with something that makes sense for us today. It's one of those stories in the Bible that leaves you head scratching, but with several, I think, pretty cool interpretive possibilities. And for some of those possibilities, in other words, what does it mean for us today? Because this is such an important text and a difficult text. I've invited two deeply respected partners in ministry to help me elucidate the lesson in its application for us today. One is a distinguished professor, and whom I know as well as Adam knew Eve. The other is a distinguished retired clergy who I consider a colleague and a friend. So let me summarize the story for you. Here's Jesus. The guy's Jesus is taking a little time off. We all need a little time off. Pastor Barton needed a long time off. After 20 years, absolutely well-deserved. Amen. And you're good people. Imagine if you weren't. Everybody needs a little time off. So he decided to leave Judea, Samaria, that region, and go north to the coast. Apparently, he loved the coast. He needed a little rest. And what's interesting about the story is that he's actually staying in the home of a Gentile. He's not staying in the home of a rich Jewish friend or ministry supporter. No, it's understood when you read the whole lesson, the whole chapter, the pre and the post, that he's actually visiting someone who doesn't happen to be a good Jew. And he is resting. But someone, a woman of all things, hears about this Jesus and goes to visit him. Now, we don't know exactly what city or town she lived in, but she was Syrophoenician, which possibly means that she lived on the west side of the northern portions of Canaan, known modern times probably Syria. Or probably just somewhere in the way up north portion of the Palestinian region. And so her travels were going to take probably a day or two. And there's indication that she comes in alone. She's no one, at least from the text, that appears to have traveled with her. And she approached Jesus, and she said to Jesus, Jesus, my daughter has a demon. She's demon-possessed. Now, please understand that in the ancient world, a lot of diseases were attributed to demons. A lot of diseases were attributed to supernatural causes. So she's responding or using the language of what she understood of the day, that she was demon-possessed. Maybe it was whatever it was. But in her mind, she was demon-possessed. She came to Jesus and said, as a mother, Jesus, I come to you because I need you to heal my daughter from afar. And Jesus looks at her and he says some very interesting words that you heard. He says to her, first let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. And then she immediately replied, says the text, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumb. Fascinating. Fascinating, Jesus' reaction to the woman visiting him on Labor Day weekend, disturbing his rest and his relaxation, and then challenging her with a quick quip about something about children and eating all they want and not giving food to the dogs. Okay, before Zaida and David share their response to the question, so what does this story mean for us today? Let me say a couple of very important things. First, that it's fascinating to me that this unnamed woman doesn't appeal to Jesus' pity or fairness in order to see her daughter healed of her ailment, but instead appeals to Jesus' intellect and justice with reasoned wittiness. There are several ways of interpreting this text when you're trying to decipher it. And some scholars and writers and teachers of the Bible say that you can explain Jesus' sort of rough around the edges response to her by four ways. One, that he was testing her to see if she was for real. Sort of like God testing Job in the Old Testament. Second, that Jesus really wasn't calling her a dog, but instead he was using the phrase little pet dogs or puppy. The Greek word would be kunaria. So he was actually using nothing more than a proverbial form of speech. And he meant it playfully. Third, that Jesus was bantering, friendly bantering, to soften a little the fact that Jews and Gentiles, there were deep differences between the two. And so he was bantering back and forth as a good Jew and a good Gentile would do in first Palestinian Jewry. First century Palestinian world. It's sort of like I and David says, example, Luis, why are you Latinos always late? And Luis will respond with, why are you Latinos, why are you white folks always so nervous? It was a banter. You know, they were bantering around. Yes, most Latinos are usually late, and most white folks are usually nervous. And then finally, the more obvious, some would say, is that, look, don't try to hide the fact that Jesus was humiliating this woman. He was really minimizing the woman precisely because she was a Gentile and not a Jew, and thus, at this very moment, for whatever reason, was expressing real, tangible racial animosity toward this woman. Ooh, wow, that's rough. Okay, having shared those exegetical views and analyses, David and Zaida, I'll start with ladies first. What does this mean for us today?
Okay. Well, as you said, this is a very difficult text, and scholars have been all over the place with it. I took a little bit of issue, if I will, okay? Let me get a little bit into that. We've already talked about this, so he's cracking up. There was one scholar, or a few scholars that I read, for instance, that said that, you know, Jesus was being a racist and sexist person, you know, that needed to be liberated by this woman, okay? And it seems to me that they're wanting to emphasize, as you mentioned, his humanity. And I'll get to the application in a minute, but this is important, okay? And they would say, for instance, well, of course Jesus was acting in this way. It was his context. And besides, he was fully human, and how are we supposed to relate to this Jesus if he wasn't fully human, acting out his prejudice, his racism, his sexism, and so on. Okay. Well, I have a problem with that. And if you can struggle with me, that would be great. To me, it's not his humanity that's in question in this text. As a matter of fact, his humanity is in question in all of the Gospels. Okay? It's always his what? His divinity that's in question, isn't it? Oh, is he, the Son of God? Is he really, Lord, and so forth and so on? And so you see Jesus always having to do miracles and especially forgive people, because that's when they're like, wait a minute, who are you to forgive people? Only God can do that. And I'm like, hello, right? Okay, so I have a problem with that, emphasis on his humanity when all of the Gospels are already, that's not an issue. He's very human. And then the other point is that he wants to raise, or that these scholars say that he wants to raise the role and importance of women at the expense, however, of Jesus' character, okay, and his divinity. And that's a problem for me as well. Why? Because here Jesus comes out as a racist, sexist pig, right? I mean, that's what follows that, doesn't it? Okay. I mean, it's a hard text. And so I read the Old Testament and I read the New Testament, and the Old Testament says that God is what? Impartial. As a matter of fact, God is always castigating, right? The Jewish people, the community, Israel, because they're mistreating the stranger in their midst. So, hello, how, he's out of character. He is a racist, sexist pig, no? Okay? And if you want more, 1 Peter 2:22, and there's a whole mess of verses, says that Jesus committed no sin, and there was no deceit in his mouth. And for me, racism is a sin. Sexism is a sin. All of those are, which is why Jesus would tell before that, to the Pharisees, you don't commit murder. As a matter of fact, even calling your brother a fool, okay, can get you to hell. I mean, that was his language, right? Okay, so I have a problem with that interpretation. So context is important for me. And I need to stay within. Okay, I'm going to hurry up. Okay, the story for me is an antithesis. It's a contradiction. It wants to show a different impression of what had gone before. So before this text, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And what does he do? The Pharisees and the Sadducees are critiquing his disciples because they're not washing his hands. Okay? Their hands before eating. And he calls them hypocrites. Okay? You're not, you're following these traditions and putting them above the commandments of God. You're hypocrites. Okay? And I'm going to rush this along. And then this woman, you have then this story versus that story, where Jesus is calling them hypocrites and everything, excuse me, for saying they love God and his commandments and everything, but not following them. And then you have this woman, a total non-Jewish woman, a stranger, okay, whom they would call a mutt, really, okay? I mean, that's the worst of dogs, right? You mutt, kind of thing. And what does she do? She throws herself at his feet, okay? She bows down and kneels before him. It says that she calls him Lord and that she worships him. Okay, I'm reading Matthew anyways, but they're, both together. So she worships him, she calls him Lord, and she asks for mercy versus the Pharisees and Sadducees and disciples that had gone before who did what? Nothing. They want to shoo away this woman, this dog, right? Just shoo her away. She's annoying. Okay? Okay, so perhaps I'm really shortening this
So
because
what
my
does it
husband is
mean
giving
for
me
us today?
the look. Okay, so perhaps one of the questions here would be for me, who are the real sheep? Okay, so you have this contradiction and, the Sadducees and the Pharisees versus this woman, this stranger, this mutt, okay? Who are the real sheep? Who is truly modeling humble tenacity here? Who is being the true covenant keeper and honoring Jesus as the Lord? As a matter of fact, it's only after, these verses in Matthew where Peter finally says, when he asks Peter, who am I? Who are people saying? And finally Peter says, you are the Lord. Well, she already had called him Lord. So really, before the disciples, it was a woman and a stranger at that who called him Lord. Okay, so anyways, I'll stop it here. You
Yes.
can come back to me and
Thank you.
I'll add a little.
David, so what does this mean for us today? Is David on?
I'm
Yes.
on. Okay, hear me now? I'm going to start with a story. Some of you heard me tell this story before. A guy was sitting on his front porch, and the summer was coming to an end, and he knew he got to paint that porch. And this guy comes walking up the sidewalk, and he said, "Sir, I'm a poor seminarian, and I need money to pay for my books. Can you help me?" And he said, "Yeah, I got a job here. I want you to paint my porch." Great. Well, back in the garage, there's everything you need. Paintbrushes, the paint, everything you need, rags, whatever. Just go on back there, and you'll find everything. So the guy goes back, and the man goes in his house, and he's talking to his wife, and she said, when are you going to get to the porch? He said, "No problem. I got this all covered. Got this guy. He's going to paint the porch." He said, You what? "Yeah, this fellow walked up, and I'm going to pay him, I'll pay him $75, I guess." "Well, honey, that's pretty cheap. Why don't you go out and help him move the furniture, get off the porch, do something. It's going to take him a long time." 20 minutes, half an hour later, he hears this rap on the door, and back door, and the guy comes standing there, and he said, "I'm done." He said, "You're done?" "Sure am." He said, "But mister, that's not a Porsche, it's a Lexus." Sometimes we just don't get it. And I think this story, for me, I listened to what you're saying, Zaida, and I'm going to take the other vantage point, the humanity of Jesus. Because for me, this is an illustration of Jesus getting it, but not quite getting it. And he needs, or at least is receptive, to the leadership of a woman to get what he hasn't completely comprehended yet. And that is the extent of his call in his ministry. And this is really encouraging for me. As someone who in the 80s, late 80s, came to the culmination of a pastoral ministry in a parish and had to make a transition, because I thought I knew what God called me to. But God was calling me to an even much more radical, much more prophetic ministry as working with domestic violence and sexual assault offenders. I thought I got it, but I didn't completely get it. Or maybe there was a transition or something in the process that Jesus himself went through of when he was standing in front of the Sadducees and Pharisees, and he issued those declarations as far as the restrictions of the Jewish law, that there were people being marginalized by that. Women, definitely. Children, definitely. They were non-persons. Gentiles. All kinds of lepers, whatever. These were people who were not fully human. They were like animal types. And so maybe to some degree he got that, but through the emphasis of a woman, he was drawn into something that he yet maybe had not even completely understood. He was a boundary breaker, and he found in a woman the impetus to break another boundary. In fact, Williams in the translation describes her as coming and throwing herself at his feet. I love that image of her throwing herself, total abandon. But she knew herself, and she respected not only Jesus and called him Lord, but she respected not only him but herself, and certainly her child. She was the great mother that he needed to see at that time. So for me, the emphasis really is on the issue of that God has perhaps, as you've been the last few weeks inviting us to look at the purpose of what God has in our life, what purpose does God calling us to? We maybe never get to the complete full fruition of that, complete understanding, but it's a process that keeps going on, being called, and other people come into our lives, like this woman did into his life, and say, come on, hear me, listen to me. That's why the rest of the passage goes on, and he's then confronted by a deaf man. And in that instance, he says to the deaf man's ears, be opened. And that's, if you look in your bulletin, there's that little quote, be opened. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going on here in Jesus' life, in a sense. Be open. Be open. Never set boundaries. And God's calling us to that too. As I emphasize repeatedly, this being a place of sanctuary. And if you're new here, you will find that. You will find a rather safe place here. But we can never relax to the point that we feel that we're not being called to be further open to something we haven't even experienced yet.
Amen.
This is called Faith Formation Sunday. And that's not a day. That's a process. That goes on and on as our faith is formed and reformed and reestablished.
David,
for me, let me just
yeah.
close with one quote that has been a very important thing to me when I discovered it years ago. And I can't trace who said this. This quote, everything nailed down has been coming loose. And that's scary when certain things that you thought you had nailed down start coming loose. Look for God in that. Look for what God is calling to you to see and experience that yet you haven't experienced.
David, before we finish, you have a bag right behind you to your right.
Yeah, those of you who know me know that I worked with offenders, domestic violence offenders, and when I retired, on several instances I had gifts given to me, but one of them that I cherish but I can't utilize because I've outgrown it. But a person who gave it to me by the name of Barbara Hart was the legal counsel for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She is one of the most powerful, influential feminists in the country. And she gave me this shirt. Feminist chicks dig me. What does that feel good for me as a pro-feminist man? But you know the thing that's scary about that is not only do I have to constantly understand the implications of that, the women continue to, and being married to Linda certainly has been, for me, a constant calling to hear the credibility, the integrity of a woman who speaks. But it's not just women, it's anyone else who might be different from me. And the issue is, do I dig them too?
Amen. Zaira, in 30 seconds, one last thought for you.
Okay, well, it's wonderful that you have heard two different views on the text. He takes the view that I am not feeling comfortable with, but I absolutely agree with the application. Absolutely. For me, the ones who need to be open to, the boundaries and the difference and so forth are the disciples and the Pharisees, because they're the ones that will be needing to minister to these so-called, they're the ones that consider themselves the purebred, versus these mutts and so forth. But that's good. You get to hear two views, and I think that's important. So that's what I take. I am not the woman, although, growing up, I was called spick, the weaker sex, right, as women, and holy roller, because I came from a Pentecostal background. So there was 3 notches below the norm of everything else. So I understand something about, being a stranger or outsider and so forth. But I also know that many a times, and probably most of the times, I'm the disciples who want to shoo other people away, or the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So, and yes, he dignifies this woman by giving her the title that they did not deserve. Woman of great faith. And that's the antithesis that I see there.
Thank you, Zaida. Thank you, David, for your time. Appreciated your contribution for helping us understand this biblical text. Thank you so much.
I'll take off my shirt and walk.
All right. Friends, we're at the end of our service. We're going to finish with a communion this morning, and we'll send you home. But certainly from this story, we can see a variety of possibilities. And if I were to contribute, so Luis, what does it mean for you, and for us today, is in combining both Zaida and David's perspective and application of this text, what I see is this woman pushing a theological truth that's throughout Jesus' ministry, that his kingdom has no boundaries, has no end, and none are excluded. And if there's any place in which this is more real, more visual, more a reality, is in the act of communion, the symbolic moment when we gather as people to break bread and to serve one another. I'm going to ask Vicky to come and join me in celebrating communion this morning.